welcome to Top 5. In this video we're looking at the top 5 horror films of all time. I will begin with a warning saying that this content is for an older audience, and if you're not into horror films, I would just go ahead and skip this video entirely. For those that are a fan, horror is one of the most recognised categories of film. With so many different conventions, it's perhaps one of the clearest genres in the film industry. Now, of course, when you look at horror, you have to take into consideration the classics, the films that made the genres, on the different subgenres, and they're easy to put together. You sprinkle in a bit of Ridley Scott, Hitchcock, Tobe Hooper, Wes Craven, John Carpenter and Giorgio Romano, and any one of their films would easily make the list. So rather than looking at the classic horror films everyone knows, I decided to put a list together of best horror films for a different reason, and I'll explain as we go. Starting, of course, with number 5.
Everybody ready? Get the show on the road!
Doesn't even show up on the GPS. It's unworthy of global positioning.
That's the whole point. Get off the grid, right?
The newest film on this list, Cabin in the Woods, is by far one of the most original horror films I have ever seen. While there are many self-aware postmodern horror films out there, Joss Whedon and Drew Goddard Cabin in the Woods is by far one of the most ambitious and original ideas I have ever seen within the horror genre. It's hard to talk about the film and not spoil or reveal the almost twist in plot, but right away as soon as the film opens you realise this isn't going to be a typical slasher horror film you would expect given the film's title. This film was made in response by the creators of how the genre had become in their eyes stale and predictable, and so this film is all about what horror is capable of, by leading you down this almost stereotypical plot line only to then not just make fun of it but also turn it on its head completely and create something genuinely new. The plotline seems quite simple enough. 5 friends are off to spend a weekend in the cabin in the woods to relax from the stresses of school. Given the location of the film and the title, we're set to believe that this is going to be a generic horror film, but very soon we see the fact that the entire trip has been orchestrated for years by a secret government group. If you're a fan of the genre, you have to check the film out just because of all the different references to virtually every horror film ever. I can't really reveal much, but what I can respond to is those that have seen the film not liking the ending. And while I personally did, horror film endings are difficult to pull off. You have to resolve the issues you've created in the film and give the audience the end to the character's journey while remembering the whole way through that the audience are there to be scared. And that's why you have so many films where the killers are still alive, they stand up, or the bodies go missing just after we thought they'd finally been killed. Or the terrible twist, shocking endings and that cheap final jump scare. I love the way this film ended from start to finish. This is fantastic in proving just how original horror can be, as well as its ending.
Now just give me a smile.
Juno, are you sure we're going the right way?
I've never been lost in my life.
One of the biggest criticisms of horror is that it's dull. Other than the jump scares and the occasional tense moments, the majority of the film is just filler, with scenes just there to make you know the characters more before they're killed. That was not the case with the film The Descent. The Descent is a British horror film and it's almost in 2 parts. The plotline follows a group of girls going potholing / cave exploring after one of them experiences a terrible tragedy. The setup should be long and drawn out until the horror kicks in, but with this film you're scared pretty much right from the start. The sense of claustrophobia that comes from the first half is terrifying in itself and would make a fantastic horror film, but as things go from bad to worse for these girls, the tension and fear never seems to leave. These girls are met with truly awful waves of horror time and time again, constantly bringing it to its peak of tension. Though at the start the characters may seem slightly stereotypical, the quiet one, the loud cocky one, the dynamic of the groups and the friends really makes a connection as the tragedy of what happened at the beginning takes form and begins to shape the characters. And as they react in the situation they're put with, their characterizations of who they are and established make sense. These people make choices that you would understand. There's also a big reveal that pushes the characters and questions what you inside yourself would do into these circumstances. Ultimately, the reason why the film is on the list is because it's terrifying pretty much throughout. Other than the slight introduction at the beginning, this film is terrifying, and it just gets worse and worse and worse for these girls.
Hello?
Hello?
Who is this?
Tell me your name, I'll tell you mine.
I don't think so.
What's that noise?
Popcorn.
You making popcorn?
Well, I'm getting ready to watch a video.
Really? What?
Oh, just some scary movie.
like scary movies.
Uh-huh.
You never told me your name.
Why do you want to know my name?
So I want to know who I'm looking at.
Now, I know I mentioned Wes Craven at the start of this list, and really if I'm mentioning Wes, I should bring in Nightmare on Elm Street, but for me, Scream was the first horror film I loved. We've all seen the movies, we all know culturally about them enough to be able to guess that she's about to die, or why run upstairs, or if you split up, you're about to be killed. The idea of these characters being self-aware and continuing to make references to other iconic horror films is just excellent. Scream feels like it was made for film fans of the horror genre. In particular, the scene when Randy, the film nerd, explains to the rest of the group of survivors about how you survive a horror film, all the while watching John Carpenter's Halloween, and yet there's still a killer in the house, is so complicated but yet so simple in how it's delivered. Or take the opening, for example. It makes sense today that a phone call from a killer would be terrifying, but at the time Scream came out, there was nothing like it. The idea of a phone call wasn't scary. In fact, shortly after Scream's release, caller ID on American phones shot up in popularity and is now a current setting on every mobile device, probably due to Scream. Some have gone as far as to list Scream as a comedy, or perhaps a dark comedy, but I don't think so. While Wes Craven set up the idea for Scream in his film Nightmare on Elm Street, Wes Craven's New Nightmare, it was perfected in Scream. Scream revitalised the genre of the slasher films, and just like Joss Whedon's Cabin in the Woods, he found a new way of presenting horror movies to a modern audience.
You're not scared, are you? Scream.
I'm gonna hide this tape when I'm finished. If none of us make it, at least there'll be some kind of record.
Again, like Wes Craven, if I'm going to mention a film by John Carpenter, it should be Halloween, which of course is an absolute classic and brought slasher genre back after Psycho. But for me, the reason why I've put The Thing on the list is because it's his most underrated horror film of all time. Looking at The Thing, the 1982 version, not the prequel made in 2011, with a group of scientists working in a remote Arctic base, they discover an alien. But this alien is able to make itself look like anyone. Whilst that seems simple enough, what it does is it separates the people from each other. Kurt Russell does an excellent job as one of the base scientists trying to get everyone together whilst also trying to work out who the alien is amongst everyone else. In fact, the Petri dish scene is one of the most tense moments of films I have ever seen, and well worth watching for that sequence alone. No possibility of help due to their remote location, they have to rely on one another, yet they can't trust each other. As such comes one of the most tense moments of who is the killer, who is the alien. The use of practical effects instead of CGI definitely adds to the horror and creepiness of the creature. With some parts becoming gory, and although I've never been a fan of, it's so well done, it just makes the film scary.
It's human. If I was an imitation, a perfect imitation, how would you know if it was really me?
Somebody in this camp ain't what he appears to be. Right now, that may be one or two of us. By spring, it could be all of us. If it takes us over, then it has no more enemies. Nobody left to kill it. And then it's won. There's a storm hitting us in 6 hours. We're gonna find out who's who.
But other than being incredibly underrated, the film is on the list because of the ending. As I said before, horror film endings tend to be typical. Usually the biggest down point of the film. So often I've seen a film I've really liked in a horror genre but hated the ending. This, in my opinion, has one of the best endings to a horror film ever. There have been cultural studies, fan videos on YouTube, all about what the end means, and I really cannot recommend the film enough. Don't spoil it for yourself, just watch.
We're gonna find out who's the thing.
And so now it comes to number one, and for me this was an easy choice. The idea of horror as a genre is ultimately rather simple. If a film scares you, it's a good horror film. It's done the job the filmmakers set out to do. But what if a film still scares you, not just days, but years, even decades after having seen it? Then it can only be perfect within the horror genre. To this day, the film continues to terrify people even years after having seen it. Don't believe me? Just try humming the famous soundtrack next time you're in the water and see how many people tell you to either shut up or get out.
There is a creature alive today who has survived millions of years of evolution. Without change, without passion, and without logic. It lives to kill.
Jaws may seem like an obvious choice, but it's on this list because it's so often forgot about when discussing great horror films, and quite simply, It shouldn't be, as this is first and foremost a horror film. As usual when talking about Steven Spielberg, there's so much I could talk about I couldn't possibly fit it into this video. Though not his first film, this was the film that made him. The very first ever blockbuster movie, Jaws is perhaps one of the most famous films ever made. Maybe for this reason people just don't consider it to be a horror film. They forget about how they watched it or how the film made them feel, or even now. The film is terrifying. Not just whilst you're watching it, but years later when you suddenly think about it when you're swimming. Hearing the tension of John Williams' score plays as the infamous shot from underwater soars has terrified people for years.
That a girl got killed here last week, and you knew it. You knew there was a shark out there. You knew it was dangerous, but you let people go swimming anyway.
You yell barracuda. Everybody says, huh? What? You yell shark. We've got a panic on our hands on the 4th of July.
It also has one of the single greatest jump scares of all time. Even having seen the film dozens of times, I still can't quite work out exactly when it's going to happen. The film is fantastic, not just because of the cultural impact it has had on the world, with great white sharks almost becoming extinct because of this film. And while it's easy to see just by looking at this film that the unknown Steven Spielberg back then would grow to become one of the greatest filmmakers of all time, it's also perfect in many other areas. It's a great example of the power of editing. This film is just perfect. Its use of camera shots is inspiring, and the score just might be one of the most famous pieces of music ever written. Even though this film is a horror film, because of how well it's regarded, it's often forgot about that it's horror, because horror isn't taken seriously. And for this reason, it's number one on my list. Quite simply, the greatest horror film ever made.
None of man's fantasies of evil can compare with the reality of Jaws.
Well, that's it. Did you agree with my list? Any thoughts, please feel free to email me. And if you want me to cover a topic in particular, just let me know and I'll make sure I cover it in the top 5. Next video, I'll be looking at binge-worthy box sets, followed afterwards by my favourite genre, coming-of-age films. But for now, thanks for watching.